Okay, Tom, we're live.
Thank you for joining our continuing fall policy season at the Korea Society. For today's program, we turn our attention to an upcoming event that is on everyone's mind, the US presidential election, and its possible effects on Korea and Northeast Asia. I'm Tom Byrne, president of the Korea Society. We welcome two distinguished speakers, former Assistant Secretary of State Danny Russel, now with the Asia Society Policy Institute, and former Acting Assistant Secretary of State Susan Thornton, now at Yale and with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. I look forward to hearing the perspectives and insights of both accomplished foreign policy practitioners and commentators. Stephen, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Noerper, Senior Director for Policy at the Korea Society. Thank you for joining, and thank you to over 300 people who have registered today, and for all of those joining online via podcast or YouTube video after. We invite you today to submit your questions to policy@koreasociety.org, and we'll get to those at the half hour. I'd like to welcome Secretaries Russel and Thornton. Susan, Danny, thank you. We've all agreed, ground rules, we're going to have some fun as we do some serious analysis and discussion here today. And we hope that this is different in tone than where we all were on Tuesday with the first presidential debate. So welcome, great to have you both. And we have a complex set of issues in the region, things changing. We're looking at the presidential election upcoming on November 3rd and what the potential impact is by way of changes for policy relative to Korea, but for Northeast Asia as well as a whole. And we'll go through some of the different states. Let's begin with you, Susan. Welcome. Thank you. And if we could invite you to share a few initial thoughts on where you see this all going.
Well, thanks very much, Stephen, and great to be with all of you. I'm especially pleased to be here with my former colleague and great mentor and a great public servant and foreign service officer, Danny Russel, who I miss very much, and I'm happy to see him on the screen today. I'll just try to give a few framing comments, and I know that Danny will inject a lot of his own counter opinions, which I'm used to, and we'll have a great discussion, I hope. When we talk about the implications of this election for Northeast Asia, I think all of us probably look forward to a day when the implications for foreign policy of a US election are not quite as grave as they are today. The US has enduring interests in the world, including maintaining a leadership role in the international system and promoting stability and prosperity and healthy, vibrant alliances and partnerships with countries around the world, of course, including the Republic of Korea. But sadly, all these interests are at stake in our upcoming election, despite the fact that these interests reflect, I think, the consensus of American people about our role in the world. So I first want to talk about, if Joe Biden is elected, because I think that is a scenario that is a bit more hopeful for addressing some of these issues. If he is elected and manages to take office in January, I think he will have 4 high priorities that will be relevant to Asia policy. First, he will be establishing a process and pay attention to governing institutions and have a set of clear policies and goals. And I think whatever you've seen of the campaign, you can tell that there are people working on plans and policies behind him, and that he has thought about all kinds of different issues that are going to be important to the future of Northeast Asia, US Korea policy toward Korea, but in general, foreign policy and the US role in the world. So that's number 1, look for establishment of an orderly process. Number 2, I think second highest priority is going to be, or maybe the highest priority will be pandemic recovery. And we've heard a lot from the Biden team about this. This will sort of consume any administration that comes in January, I think. not only dealing with the health crisis, but certainly dealing with the economic recovery and the fallout from the pandemic. And I would look for a Biden administration to turn more toward international cooperation, international communication, to deal with the pandemic recovery than what we've seen so far from the United States on these issues. Third, I would say international institutions. I anticipate that a Biden administration would pretty quickly out of the blocks give signals about the US regaining leadership in international institutions by probably first and foremost making it clear that the US will rejoin the World Health Organization and contribute to efforts there having to do with the pandemic. I expect pretty quickly that a Biden administration would recommit to the Paris Climate Accord targets and the agreement, and other international issues and international institutions that the Trump administration has turned away from. I think that we would quickly see the Biden administration turn back toward. And fourth, and these aren't in any particular order, of course, the Biden administration has made it clear that they want to recommit to alliances around the world and repair some of the damage that's been done to our partnerships and our alliances with our friends around the world. So I think these priorities, assuming that Biden can make progress coming into office, should be welcomed not only in the Republic of Korea, but by many people in the international community. Now, this doesn't mean, and I expect Danny might talk a little bit more about this, that the fundamental challenges that we face in the international system with China, with North Korea, or with other transnational threats will have been resolved or even addressed. And I think a lot of these issues are going to take time for the Biden administration to get into office and get up to speed. I think that if these things will be addressed, the Biden administration is going to need a lot of help from our partners around the world, like our friends in the ROK and elsewhere. We'll need to repair a lot of damage, fix some structural problems, and get a vision of the future that is more hopeful. And I think that on North Korea, it's my view that the Biden administration would be much more likely to get progress on this issue than a second Trump administration would be. And that the Biden administration would work with the ROK and other partners to set up a process to try to get there. That said, this is not going to be the top of the list of priorities for a new administration. And I think that we can expect probably a provocation from the North after the election to bring the issue back into the focus of attention for a new administration. And unfortunately, that would probably short circuit efforts to approach this issue in a concerted and creative way. Might reaffirm commitments to sanctions, for example, on the part of a new administration, and will give a new administration probably less space to maneuver. And depending on the makeup of the Congress, could really thwart any efforts to get something going on this issue, early in an administration. So with that, maybe I'll end my comments there. I could certainly talk about the advent of a second Trump administration, but I think, we've seen what the first Trump administration has brought, and I think in a second Trump administration, we could expect much more of the same as we saw in the debate, and that there would be continued disorder and chaos in the foreign policy realm. So I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I think I'll just leave my opening provocation there and let Danny rebut as he will. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Danny Russel.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's great to join you and to join Susan, of course. I totally disagree with everything that Susan said and think she's just gotten it completely wrong. No, I'm kidding. Susan, of course, is a veteran foreign policy practitioner, and that means she's a realist, as well as an optimist, as well as a pessimist, in all the right places. So, of course, she's gotten it right. And frankly, she's used up all the smart things to say. So But I'm not going to let that stop me. So I'll add a few thoughts of my own. I mean, for me, talking to friends and policymakers in Northeast Asia, what I think I'm finding is that whoever wins in November, and I think there's a widespread hope in the region that it will be Biden and a return to some semblance of normalcy, but whoever wins, America's image in the region and Asian countries' confidence in the United States has really taken a beating. You know, there have been a series of shocks throughout the last 4 years. 2020 has really taken the cake. The debate on Tuesday certainly didn't help. And if there's a prolonged battle over the results of the election, then that will be yet another damaging blow. So, you know, the region is watching very intently. I think our friends in the region want to see America get its mojo back. Our not so friends in the region think that they're seeing the contradictions and the class struggle in our capitalist system that are going to bring about the inevitable decline that Marx predicted. They feel like the correlation of forces are aligned in their favor and against the United States and other democracies. So I think first and foremost, the winner of the election is going to face a situation in which the United States just has so much less credibility and respect in Northeast Asia than at any other time in our modern history. And I mean, that's impressionistic, but it's also pretty well documented in Pew polls and so on. But secondly, that whoever wins is going to have really urgent domestic business to deal with, overwhelming challenges at home. Susan went through some Biden top priorities, and I agree with them, but I think that either person is going to have to deal with the pandemic and the attempt to try to implement a vaccination program, which is really going to be a challenge, deal with the recession and the massive unemployment, deal with the social and the racial tensions, the political polarization, the really severe economic disparity in the United States. Remember, the election has not been about foreign policy. It's not been about Asia. And neither will the first 100 days of the administration. Now, I mean, it's true that an incident with China, say in the South China Sea, or a North Korean provocation, which, as Susan correctly points out, is more likely than not. Those sorts of things can force Northeast Asia issues into the forefront of a very crowded policy agenda, and that happened to the Obama administration in 2009. Sort of the first crisis was North Korea's detention of 2 American journalists. But that notwithstanding, the next president's going to really have to focus at the outset at home and trying to heal the country, or depending on who it is, trying to crush their enemies. I mean, Susan talked about some of the policy approaches and the differences in approach in a Biden administration. I agree. But in the event that Biden wins, the two things that I would flag that really affect both U.S. policy towards Asia and I think affect the countries in Northeast Asia are these. Number one, the Senate. If the Republicans retain control of the Senate, then it's not just that the Biden administration is going to be focused on domestic challenges, it's that the Biden administration is going to be embroiled in a level of political guerrilla warfare with Senate Republicans that is going to obstruct and prevent the administration from following through on the 4 priorities that Susan outlined. And I know this from experience because in trying to implement the rebalance to Asia and from 20 2012, when the Republicans retook the Senate, we ran into tremendous headwinds. The second thing I'd flag as a consideration we're going to have to navigate through is the very long, awkward, odd 11-week or so transition period between when the election is held, or in our case, I think it will be when the election is finally adjudicated. So it may not be so many weeks until January 20th, the inauguration. And so quite apart from any uncertainty about the election results itself, I think when we're in the transition, our friends in Asia are going to have to brace themselves for a barrage of confusing, mixed signals, mixed messages. You know, the incumbent is still president until January 20th, noon. I'm sure the Biden people will respect that. But the whole world and, you know, the whole country is going to be asking for answers from the president-elect. And, you know, at the same time, we're already seeing zealots within the administration who are worried about the possibility of losing the election, pushing through decisions and extreme actions to try to lock in hardline policies. So imagine what they might do once it's definitive that they have, in fact, actually lost. I'll stop here and we can turn to your questions.
Sure. I'd like to run a few things a bit more, and thank you both for really weaving a very rich tapestry for us for discussion today. Maybe first and foremost, since you both had so much experience in the area of management of relations with China, and certainly for all the nations, to include Korea and the region, you know, looking at where China and the United States are now and the disintegration of the relations over time. It seems that both campaigns, according to some estimates, you know, are trying to move to the right of the other on China and to be tougher. Do you think that reverts in the event of a Biden election, given his relationship with Xi? Do you think Donald Trump goes in a different direction with China? Because we've seen over the course of the campaign, things continue to worsen, especially by way of the rhetoric, but certainly in terms of the challenges to which you both alluded. Susan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think that the election being over will have an impact on the approach to China, whether it be Biden winning or Trump winning. Trump right now, I mean, certainly the relationship between the US and China has been declining over the course of the Trump presidency to date, but took a real, you know, we had on January 20th, the signature of this phase 1 trade deal with China, which people were thinking, aha, you know, this is a turn for, you know, a somewhat better course forward with China. And then 3 days later, we had the Wuhan lockdown and we had the pandemic. And then, you know, a month later or so, we had Trump with the China virus, and seeing his, you know, clear diminution of his electoral fortunes in tandem with the pandemic, and, you know, obviously his turn to blaming China for it, et cetera, et cetera. So he has really changed in his attitude toward China in connection with the election. So if he manages to win the election, he doesn't have to blame China anymore for his electoral fortunes, and he can turn back to, I think, a sort of a pre-COVID kind of negative attitude toward China that won't have as much venom embodied in it, and he'll, I think, be still looking for, you know, economic deals with China at that point. The Chinese, you know, even now are on the hook to buy a lot of agricultural products from the Midwest between now and November 3rd. And Donald Trump wants those deals to be done. He wants those purchases to go through. The Chinese aren't going to be able to buy enough to fulfill all their obligations from the phase 1 trade deal. But, you know, presumably after the election, they'll still be buying lots of things. And I think we should see a bit of a settling down to a pretty negative status quo ante, but still not as bad as what we've got right now with Trump vis-a-vis China. for Biden, I think, he's definitely gonna, as far as the duration of the campaign goes and through the election, try not to have any reason for China to come up as a subject of division between Trump and himself in the campaign. And so, what kind of tack he'll take, after he's inaugurated will depend a little bit on what happens between now and January, which could be a lot on the China file. And will also depend a little bit on how things stand in January with respect to the pandemic and other urgent issues that he's got to deal with. But I think, the idea that I mentioned at the top of my remarks and priorities about getting back to some kind of normal order in governing institutions, in communications processes, in coordination of policies, will kind of have the effect of sort of tamping down the sort of level of tension in a way in the unpredictability in the U.S.-China relationship once he comes into office. Even if he doesn't tackle any particular issue right away, I think it'll just the procedural and the appearance of order will help to kind of stabilize things a bit, assuming nothing urgent or bad or crisis related happens.
Danny, is your thinking along the same line?
Yeah, you use, Stephen, the phrase revert to previous characteristics in the U.S.-China relationship. I wouldn't use that word. I don't think that there's ever going to be a reversion to an earlier, arguably happier relationship. But I do think that, as Susan pointed out, and for many of the reasons she cited, that in either case, a Biden or a Trump administration, a lot of the friction, Sturm and Drang will partially abate. And as she pointed out, in 2020, Donald Trump has given free rein to the toughest China hawks in the administration, people that he had kept on a very short leash prior to that. And he did it because his political interests dictated that. After the election, the equation will change, and I think we could expect him to revert to his sort of authentic self, so to speak, namely that the issues that he really cares about, namely trade and the trade in goods balance with China, and his tunnel vision on that score has been pretty well documented, and also his core faith that his personality and his charisma and his direct dealings with his buddy Xi Jinping are going to be dispositive in working to America's advantage. Now, Congress will never allow a reelected Donald Trump to revert to the golden era of his Mar-a-Lago love fest with Xi Jinping or his glorious golden November 2017 state visit to Beijing. So no, it won't go back even to that. Chinese behavior, of course, will be a factor. And look, even if the US tried to mend fences with the Chinese, let's bear in mind, number one, that the Chinese, compared to 4 years ago, are feeling their oats, believe that, as I said, the correlation of forces is behind them, that America is dramatically weakened, that they're stronger. And in addition to that, I'm convinced that we have indelibly cemented in the Chinese mind the idea that the US is simply hostile, is untrustworthy, in addition to being in decline. And that's going to mean that competition is going to get nastier and cooperation is going to be more challenging. Now, that said, in a Biden administration, as Susan has pointed out, we'll have not only a president, but a group of people who have experienced for themselves the objective fact that it is possible to shape competition so that it's kind of more like the Yankees versus the Red Sox and less like, the Bloods versus the Crips or something. It's not a fight to the death. Moreover, you've got a group of people who also have experience in balancing competition and even friction management with cooperation on critical issues. Further, as Susan pointed out, not just the matter of organizing a process within the US government and the national security system so we don't have an incoherent, chaotic mix of incompatible announcements and policies. But beyond that, a Biden administration understands that we have to communicate with the Chinese, transmit and receive as well, and that Twitter won't do it, telepathy won't do it, denunciations from the pulpit won't do it. We've actually got to talk to these guys, and while it doesn't always result in a reconciliation or even resolution of a problem, it's a major component of any effort to manage differences and prevent crises.
Danny, if I could ask you a little bit about North Korea and what all that's been said about the chance of provocation after the election, and also the suggestions that are made in the community that on the one hand, Donald Trump did sit down with Kim Jong-un and that represented a different approach, which again, arguably, depending on where one sits, did or didn't make a difference. And then secondly, on that aspect, are we at an impasse? Is it time for a new policy on North Korea?
Well, great questions. Thank you. I think that it is prudent to anticipate that, particularly in the event of a Biden administration, that we should expect some provocations from North Korea. That's certainly the playbook that is familiar to us from the past. When a new administration comes in, you need to create a crisis. It's like housebreaking your new puppy. Show them that they're just going to have a world of hurt if they take a real tough line, that North Korea can make life miserable and distract from the administration's priorities if the US doesn't sort of buy off the North Koreans. At a minimum, they want to spook the new administration and see if they can get something out of that. So it's reasonable to expect that. What exactly it will be remains to be seen. Of course, there are a number of options. And one concern, I think, will be that the new Biden administration could get locked into such a hard and adversarial response that it precludes the possibility of a more creative outreach early on. But we'll have to see. The idea of dealing directly with the leader in an authoritarian dictatorship was not a new idea. And I struggled to try to find a way to credit the Trump administration for doing this. But the fact is, number one, that the way that they went about it, utterly without laying the groundwork, without preparation, squandered one of the few points of real leverage that the United States has with North Korea, the desire dating back to Kim Il-sung to be shown as a peer to the President of the United States, a legitimate international leader. And second, when you look at the outcome, frankly, we are far worse off in the aftermath of the three encounters than we were before. North Korea's arsenal has grown many times over. Sanctions enforcement have been dealt a real set back by the legitimacy that was conferred on Kim Jong-un, not just by the summits, but by this lovey-dovey exchange of hallmark cards and notes and so on. I think that it's quite clear that we are at an impasse in the sense that Kim Jong-un believes that he's crossed the point of no return in the establishment of his nuclear program, that the world, he clearly believes, or at least is betting, has no choice but to reconcile themselves to the unhappy reality of a nuclear North Korea. The point, though, is that while the reality may be that North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, there is no reason why North Korea should gain all the benefits of full enfranchisement in the international system while it's in complete defiance of international law and UN Security Council resolutions. So, in that sense, there is a deadlock. There is a universe of options. Many of them have been tried and in a variety of combinations, but there certainly are things that can be put on the table. What I wish we could change is not the policy, but the opponent, the antagonist, North Korea, but we can't. And so we're going to have to find the right combination of deterrence, of defense, of diplomacy that can prevent the situation from deteriorating rapidly.
Thank you, Danny. Susan, before I turn to the audience questions, if I could ask you on the issue of pandemic relief, which you led with, and you also noted alliance management. Clearly, South Korea, as you suggested, can help us, can help the international community, can help the United States. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about the balance of turning to South Korea for what it can help us with, and then the alliance management issues as they stand today, meaning a difficult year, especially by way of the special measures agreement, the host nation support discussions, and then some concern that the US is perhaps out of step in terms of supporting the Blue House on inter-Korean reconciliation to the degree that it would like to be supported. Do you have some thoughts on how one balances opportunity, alliance management, and where we go there?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Those are good questions, and it's definitely worth having a candid conversation about these topics as well. I think one of the things it's hard for me to look for silver linings in the sort of Trump policy that as it's been sort of prosecuted here and see any good sides of it. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that one of the things that Trump has done he has unfortunately moved the Overton window, fortunately or unfortunately, in discussions about what the US should expect as far as contributions from other friends and partners around the world in upholding its global security responsibilities. And so I think while I certainly wouldn't have prosecuted the SMA negotiations in the way that the Trump administration has done it, the issue of sort of how we share these contributions to global security and to the alliance and to what we're trying to do together is something that was bound to come up sooner or later. And I think now it's kind of a healthy conversation that we can have going forward, assuming that the Biden administration comes in and things get put into a more orderly track. I don't think this conversation is going to end with the SMA negotiation, whatever compromise we reach to solve that one problem. And I do think that we will find a compromise to solve that problem over time, no matter who's elected. But I think the whole issue is going to continue. And frankly, I think that one of the things that's going to have to happen is that other countries around the world are going to have to start thinking about their own agency in the system and how they can step up and help. I mean, this has been brought up, frankly, in the context of the US, not only the rebalance, but what I would like to think of as the continuation of the rebalance policy, which is the US Indo-Pacific strategy that has been the sort of bumper sticker of the Trump administration for its Asia policy. But there's a lot of elements of that that get at the issue of how can other countries help, and what more can they be doing, and what more could the US be doing to help other countries help themselves, et cetera. And I think that conversation is going to continue. As far as, what can be done with respect to helping the South Koreans and President Moon have the kind of involvement and opportunities that the South Koreans want to see have happen with the North Koreans, I think that is going to be something that is going to play out in the context of, what kinds of actions we see from the North, what kinds of crises the Biden administration is facing early on in the administration. But I think there will be certainly an intention on the part of a new Biden administration to work more closely with the ROK and to listen more to the ROK. Now, whether they will be able to give the ROK the kinds of flexibilities and policies to do things like humanitarian assistance that South Korea has been advocating for is an open question. But I think there would be a more receptive audience to those kind of questions and, requests than there has been up to date. I think another thing that's going to come in for a lot of discussion is the whole issue of the sanctions regime. What have we learned from sanctions on North Korea from this last, 3-4 year period? What do we have in the international community in the way of continuing determination and leverage on the sanctions regime, and how should we best be using whatever we have left to as leverage for negotiation with the North Koreans going forward? So those are all questions I expect to be taken up again. But I think, as far as the alliance goes, having the election behind us will be a good thing, and having a Biden team in place would also be a good thing if we could get that.
Susan Thornton, Danny Russell, thank you. We're going to turn now to my colleague, Jonathan Corrado, with audience questions. Jonathan.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our audience members for sending in a lot of questions, good amount of interest thus far. Please keep them coming in. You can email to policy@koreasociety.org. There are some overlapping questions with things that we've addressed already. So in those instances, I'll do my best to reframe them so we can touch some new angles. We're going to start off with a question from Jung No from Radio Free Asia. Jung asks, if foreign policy does come up in the next presidential debate, what question would you like to be addressed about North Korea policy? So this one is for either Mr. Russell or Ms. Thornton, whoever is eager to jump on it.
I think the key question, and it's not a partisan question, is America safer or more vulnerable today to the threat from North Korean nuclear armed ICBMs than it was 4 years ago? And similarly, is the threat to America's allies in the region, South Korea and Japan in particular, still something that we are committed to deter and to defend again? I think the president raised some grave uncertainty when he gave North Korea a pass on the intermediate range missiles that were launched right into the Sea of Japan, saying in a press conference with Prime Minister Abe standing next to him, well, that wasn't aimed at us. That's really not a violation of the Singapore Agreement. So getting more clarity in the election period for the American public about what U.S. bona fide national security interests are vis-a-vis North Korea, and where that currently stands, I would say is a priority. So that's the question I would ask.
Great, thank you. Any addition to that, Ms. Thornton?
I personally would try as hard as I could to refrain from asking any foreign policy questions in the next debate.
Yes, ma'am, understood. Okay, next question is from Kim Gamel, a reporter with Stars and Stripes, and Charlie Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance. And they ask about a notion that has come up already, but maybe we could look at it from a different angle. And that's the notion of an October surprise. So that could be either a military provocation or a surprise diplomatic contact. How do you think this could impact the presidential election outcome?
Well, I'll go first since it's my turn, and I put you on the spot last time, Danny. I am worried and have been worried about an October surprise, whether it be in the context of North Korea, whether it be in the context of China or Iran or some other place in the world. And I definitely would think that if it was useful to President Trump's reelection prospects, it would be something that we would have to take quite seriously as a risk. But I have to say that with the very unfortunate passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I believe, at least my gut tells me, that the risk and the possibility of an October surprise, from the side of the U.S. administration or some kind of U.S. action is much lower. And I guess I would say an October surprise, I heavily discount the possibility of an October surprise coming from North Korea or China or other adversaries, just given that most of those parties do not want to disrupt the election or think that whatever provocation they might entertain would not have the intended result. So I guess I am fairly sanguine that we'll have a lot of ups and downs between now and November 3rd, but I'm fairly sanguine that they're not going to come from an overseas crisis that is purposely perpetuated for the reason of interfering in the election or affecting the election outcome.
Understood. Thank you. Mr. Russell.
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say to Ken, Stars and Stripes, we're glad you're still around. Keep the faith, keep going. October surprise, look, we've had surprises, more surprises than I think most American voters can handle already in the campaign. And frankly, they haven't really moved the needle all that much. So I'm not convinced that a foreign policy October surprise would necessarily be dispositive in the election. But I think it's an awful time from the perspective of U.S. national security interests, because you really want to ensure that the president and the national security team is responding and taking decisions free from extraneous political considerations. And so the need to look tough, act tough, and so on is as dangerous or more dangerous than the desire to try to manufacture some sort of phony international triumph. I think on October 10th, it's entirely plausible that we will see North Korea try to flaunt the quantitative improvement, maybe the qualitative improvement in its arsenal when they conduct the parade. It's clearly been mass producing weapons. But I very much agree with what Susan said, in that the North Koreans are perhaps more inclined to teach a lesson and to housebreak a new Biden administration than they are to throw a monkey wrench into what's already a kind of wild and crazy U.S. election.
Okay, thank you. Now we've got a question from Unjung Cho from the Voice of America and James Raynal from NK News, and they both are just looking for a little bit more on how the Biden administration and the Trump administration too would approach denuclearization. What do you think is the biggest difference in terms of what the approach would be going forward? And any changes in the Trump camp, given that this is now the second administration, and what would be the big change in terms of the Biden approach?
Well, let me take a shot, and Susan can correct me. It's easy for me to imagine a re-elected President Trump trying to rekindle his bromance with Kim Jong-un and try for some sort of grand bargain with North Korea. That's clearly where he had attempted to go. We know from John Bolton's book, and frankly, we know from simply the press, that the president strongly resisted the focus on denuclearization. He certainly ignored other important issues, including human rights, and even the case of the American citizen who died in North Korean custody, Otto Warmbier, which had been a showpiece at the State of the Union address, utterly was expunged from the agenda once this pursuit of a grand bargain and a Nobel Prize started in earnest. But it's equally obvious to me that that kind of an effort is doomed to fail in a second term as well, because North Korea simply is not going to buy these, sales pitches, these promises, condos in Wonsan, KFC franchises in downtown Pyongyang. Doesn't move them. And North Korea has clearly absolutely no intention of following through willingly on any real steps to roll back its nuclear missiles program. So, that dramatic reconstitution of the Trump outreach is just not going to end well. I think what we would more likely see is something that looks a bit like the last 2 years, should there be a second Trump term, where we've got something of a phony peace, at least for a while North Korea hides behind China, sends these long flattering messages to Donald Trump, an occasional summit, but it forges ahead with its manufacturing of nukes, ballistic missiles, reentry vehicles, developing its cyber weapons and cyber theft, smuggling, and so on and so forth. I think that a big difference with Joe Biden is that he's a true believer in America's strength. You don't hear him saying Americans are losers. Our allies and partners have taken advantage of everybody's winning, America's losing. That's not his point of view. He came into public service, second point, during the Cold War. He dealt very extensively with the Soviet Union, with Eastern Bloc countries. In other words, he knows a thing or two about dealing with authoritarian Leninist systems. And I would fully expect that the target that President Biden would be aiming at is that sweet spot where he is showing strength, but not gratuitously provoking or escalating, where he is engaging with them on his terms, but not chasing after them or getting diddled by them. And as Susan has pointed out, where he is working very, very closely in partnership with critical allies, first and foremost, the Republic of Korea.
Okay, wonderful. Ms. Thornton, any additions to that?
I think Danny covered it well. I guess, I would expect to see a pretty, as I mentioned at the outset of my earlier remarks, orderly process put in place by the Biden administration to try to generate some U.S. government, not consensus, because I don't think we'll ever get that in the U.S. government about North Korea, but some at least low threshold unity with which we can approach partners and allies and put forward an approach that I think the Biden administration thinks it could actually move forward with, and together with whatever the constellation in Congress is. I mean, North Korea has been such a divisive issue traditionally in the US government, even long before Donald Trump was running for president. So I think trying to cobble together a domestic coalition that can help to pursue whatever the approach is going to be something that they're going to try to focus on early.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to do one more question before we transition back to Stephen for the closer. This one is about Japan, US-Japan relations and trilateral relations between America, Korea, and Japan. This one comes from Kotaro Ono from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Kotaro asks if the transition of leadership in Japan is going to have an impact in the way that the U.S. deals both with Japan, but also regionally, looking towards its strategy with inter-Korean relations, China, et cetera, and trilateral cooperation between Seoul, Tokyo, and D.C. Any thoughts on that one?
Danny, why don't you take that first?
Okay.
You know all the players better than I do.
Okay. Well, thanks, Ono-san. The transition in leadership in Japan is not dramatic. Suga is carrying on, by and large, the policies that he helped implement in 8 years as chief cabinet secretary. Pretty close to being number 2 in the Japanese government. So I think there's a high degree of continuity in that respect. If it were to emerge that there were, meaningful differences, I think the general perception so far is that Suga himself is less perhaps ideological when it comes to certain issues of nationalism or history than perhaps Prime Minister Abe was. But nevertheless, it seems unlikely, but were it to emerge that there was a lot more political will in a Suga government and a lot more political space in Japan for an effort to reclaim some degree of reconciliation with Korea, then obviously US policymakers would be interested in encouraging that for our own national security and geostrategic reasons. But that seems pretty unlikely. And in any event, there is no expectation of an improvement in the perspective and the approach on the part of the Moon government when it comes to Japan. So I think the prospects for progress between the two allies of the US or on a trilateral basis represent still quite an uphill battle. Now, I think one question attached to the succession in Japan is the longevity of the Suga government. If Prime Minister Suga proves to be essentially a substitute teacher, a placeholder who serves out the remainder of the 1 year left in the Abe LDP presidential term and then calls elections and moves on or steps down and elections are called by a more politically appealing LDP leader, then there's going to be a different environment in Japan, and presumably a higher hurdle when it comes to making progress on issues like bilateral or trilateral alliance cooperation. If, on the other hand, he calls elections soon and wins a conclusive victory in his own right and is expected to retain leadership of Japan for years to come, then clearly there's more room to engage in innovative regional diplomacy. We will see. I know from experience that President Biden played a significant role in encouraging some rapprochement, some progress in the relationship between Seoul and Tokyo. I know that his starting point is American interests and not telling other people what he thinks they ought to do. His point always was, this is what is important to the United States and why. So an elected Biden as president would be, I think, both crystal clear and quite insistent that the inability of the two critical democracies, two key US allies in Northeast Asia, to work together in defense-related areas, given the very direct threat that we all face from the DPRK, and given the geostrategic pressures of Chinese behavior, is deleterious to America's own national security. And for that reason, not in some sort of goody-goody moralistic sense, but from a very hard-bitten realpolitik perspective, that's intolerable, and that the two need to do a better job in practical cooperation in the realm of security.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mrs. Thornton, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I completely agree with Danny. I look at the governments involved in this sort of trilateral dance right now, and I don't see a lot of prospect for quick improvement. Although I will say that from where I sit, I've been quite pleased with the way Japan has stepped up and played a leadership role in the region, while the Trump administration has kind of faded from the international scene on things like CPTPP and other things. Watching the Japan-Korea relationship over the last couple of years, I mean, it's been sad, and it's been a feeling that you're watching this kind of children throwing sand in a sandbox. But of course, the U.S. doesn't have any position from which to admonish or correct, since we're doing things that are even more juvenile. So what I kind of look at, and maybe just to leave it on a bit more optimistic note, I mean, if we can't look to the governments to do anything about improving the atmosphere for the relations between these two important allies of ours, maybe we can count on people. And I will note that there is hopefully the Tokyo 2021 now Olympics coming, and things like that do present an opportunity to sort of change the calculus, or change up the narrative a bit. And maybe if people get on the right side of history and start demanding that their governments behave a bit more like adults with a bit more responsibility, if the US would come back to the sort of liberal international economic system and stop encouraging everybody to break rules, who knows what might happen. So we could see some improvement. I still hold out hope. But I agree with Danny that certainly the Biden administration knows this issue very well. They've put a lot of time and energy into it. And they will be focused on trying to do what the U.S. could do to encourage somewhat of a reconciliation here.
Thank you. Danny, Susan, thank you so much today. You did both touch on the issue of the domestic calculus and what happens in terms of the election and Capitol Hill. We'll be addressing some of those issues in our post-election analysis on November 5th. And for that, we have a former Senate Foreign Relations Committee senior staffers, Keith Luce and Frank Januzzi. Keith now with the National Committee on North Korea, and Frank now the president and CEO of the Mansfield Foundation. So clearly we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about what that calculus looks like. But thank you for a rich hour and extremely valuable insights at a time that both of you have described as incredibly important and seminal in terms of how we look not only at Asia policy, but the broader questions at play. I'd like to thank a few other people and constituencies. We'd like to thank all those members of the Asia Society and the Asia Society Policy Institute who have joined today, as well as the members of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. We at the Korea Society value our relations with both institutions, and we encourage you to review their sites, to support them as much as you support us. And we're honored to have their members with us, as always. We'd like to thank the members of the media, and there have been a number of you on today, and we very much value your participation. We'd like to thank our primary supporter for our public policy series, the Korea Foundation, for its continued support. And I'd like to thank from the Korea Society, Tom Byrne, President, Jonathan Corrado, our Policy Director, and Peter Stemke, our Director of Technology, who keeps all our great podcasts and YouTube videos going. We'd invite you back then on the 15th, and any of you who are available for next Tuesday, October 7th, we will be having a gala. Please see koreasociety.org, and my colleagues in development would be very happy to have you aboard. We could certainly use your support. Thank you again all, and Danny, Susan, thanks so much.